It was just after 10 p.m. Cold wind passed through the streets of Deptford as families wrapped up for the night. In one small flat on Evelyn Street, voices rose in laughter. Music played softly. Plates were cleared. A birthday had been celebrated, and the last of the guests were getting ready to leave. Maureen Gitau stood near the door with her phone in one hand and her coat in the other. She told her mother she'd be stepping out for a bit. She didn't say where she was going. She just smiled, hugged her aunt, and said she'd be back soon. She never came back. No one saw her again. No one heard her voice again. That was the last moment her family would ever share with her. No final words. No goodbye. Just silence. Hours later, in another part of southeast London, a man was seen on camera. He was alone. He wore surgical gloves and pushed a large waste bin through a basement corridor. The footage had no sound, no background noise, just the steady movement of wheels turning on concrete and a man's eyes that never looked up. That man was Mark Moody. He was 55 years old, a cleaner, quiet, kept to himself. No criminal history, nothing that would raise suspicion. He had once worked with Maureen. They cleaned side by side at the Oval Cricket Ground. They shared breaks, smoked together, laughed sometimes. Some say they were more than colleagues. Others say she trusted him like a big brother. Only two people knew what really went on between them. Now, only one remains. At first, police didn't know what to think. There was no struggle, no blood, no witnesses. Just a missing girl and a man who claimed he gave her 10 pounds and a cigarette before walking away. But his story didn't match the evidence. And the bin? That wasn't just any bin. It was a communal waste container from a block of flats. Richmond House, a building where Moody worked during the day, a place that was locked at night, a place Maureen had no reason to enter. So how did she get there? Why did she go? And what happened inside those walls? Over the next few weeks, what started as a missing person case turned into one of the most complex investigations the Met Police had ever handled. More than 500 hours of CCTV, over 2,700 tons of rubbish, and a desperate search through filth and ash because police feared the unthinkable had happened. Before we go deeper into this disturbing case, take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And hey, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. To really understand the complexity of this case, let's take it slowly from the beginning, and I need you to follow me closely. Remember that on December 5th, 2022, the Gitau home was full of laughter. The living room glowed with soft lights. There were cousins on the floor, aunties dancing near the table, and Maureen, she was smiling. She had always been the quiet one, soft-spoken, polite, always helping out without being asked. At just 24, she was the kind of daughter every parent prayed for. She didn't drink much. She wasn't loud. She stayed close to family, even when she was working full-time. That day, they were celebrating her aunt's birthday. It wasn't a big party, just close family and food. Someone brought a small cake. A few of the cousins had gotten balloons. And Maureen? She was wearing jeans, a black hoodie, and her favorite white sneakers, the ones she cleaned with a toothbrush every Sunday. She had helped her mom cook. She passed out plates. She laughed at the jokes, even the dry ones. Everything about her seemed normal, calm, just another family evening in Deptford. But around 9 p.m., her phone buzzed. She looked at it, paused, then walked into the kitchen with it held close. Her mom thought maybe it was one of her girlfriends. A few minutes later, Maureen came back into the living room, grabbed her coat, and whispered to her cousin, "I'll be back soon." She didn't take a bag. She didn't say a big goodbye. Just a smile, a wave, and the words, "I'm just meeting someone. I'll be right back." Her mom remembers watching her walk out the door. The hall light flickered once before it shut. She never saw her again. Have you ever felt like someone you trusted was hiding something? Please share your thoughts below. Maureen was the second-born of 5, the only girl. Her brothers used to call her Boss Lady because she was always trying to keep them in line. She had dreams, small ones, but hers. She wanted to save up to study beauty therapy, open her own shop someday, do nails, braids, make women feel good about themselves. But for now, she worked. She had a job at the Oval Cricket Ground, cleaning mostly, early mornings, long shifts. She didn't complain. She showed up on time and got things done. It was there, somewhere between the mop buckets and coffee breaks, that she met Mark Moody, a man twice her age. Quiet, kept to himself. The others said he didn't talk much unless you spoke first. But Maureen had a way of making people feel seen. She greeted everyone, and he responded to that. He started helping her out, giving her longer breaks, carrying supplies. One day he brought her a coffee. Another day, he offered to walk her to the bus stop. You know those little things people do to help, right? He wasn't handsome, I'm not sorry to say this. Not the type Maureen would usually mention. But he was nice, kind. That's what she told her friend once when asked why she spoke to him. He's not weird, she said. He's just older. I think he's lonely. Nobody knows what Mark Moody saw in Maureen, whether it was her youth, her kindness, or just the fact that she paid attention to him. But something about her pulled him in. Slowly, he became more than just a coworker. He started messaging her. Casual at first. You working today? Need help with your shift? Then it got more personal. One day, he showed up near her bus stop. Not at the cricket ground. Just standing there, waiting. He told her he lived nearby, that he could walk her part of the way home. She didn't think much of it. London is full of people with strange habits. But he kept showing up. By the end of November, her family noticed she was quieter. Still helpful. Still polite. But her phone was always in her hand. And she'd step outside more often when it rang. Then came December 5th. The night everything broke. It was around 9:30 p.m. when Maureen left the party. The last photo of her taken that day was on her cousin's phone. Maureen smiling with a paper plate in her hand, standing behind the cake. The family didn't worry at first. She'd stepped out before. She always came back. An hour passed. Then 2. They called her. No answer. At 1 a.m., her phone went to voicemail. Still, no panic. She's a grown girl, her uncle said. Maybe she stayed over with a friend. By morning, they were calling everyone. Her closest friends hadn't heard from her. Her boss hadn't seen her. She didn't show up for work. She didn't check her messages. Her mother called again and again, even though she knew what would happen. Each time, the same empty ring, followed by silence. Later, when police reviewed the data, they discovered Maureen's phone had traveled, but Maureen hadn't. Her signal moved from Deptford to Richmond House, then disappeared. That was the first time detectives said her name out loud in the station, and the first time her mother felt the crack inside her chest begin to split. They learned she had told her cousin she was meeting someone. They traced her call logs, and one name kept coming up, Mark Moody. He was brought in for questioning. He didn't seem nervous. Said they had spoken that night, but only for a moment. Claimed he met her at a bus stop, gave her a cigarette, and £10 to help her get home. That was it. Just 5 minutes. Then she walked away, and he walked the other direction. But that wasn't true. None of it was. Because security cameras said something else. And what they revealed next left even the most experienced officers frozen in front of the screen. Mark Moody was a 55-year-old cleaner. He wasn't anything special to look at. In fact, he seemed to blend into every crowd. A man who went unnoticed. Quiet. Unassuming. A worker in the background. A man whose life could have been as dull as his uniform if he had simply stayed in the shadows. But there was something about him that made people curious. He had access to places most people didn't. Different buildings. Restricted areas. Places where he could move around without raising suspicion. Like Richmond House. For years, he cleaned offices, hallways, and backrooms, places people didn't think twice about. He knew the ins and outs of every building he worked in, including the small, hidden corners. The places the CCTV didn't always reach. The places no one would ever expect. But there was something else about him, too, something deeper. A darkness that he wore like a second skin. And that's what made Maureen's disappearance even more confusing. When Maureen vanished, the police knew they had to dig into his life. His story had to be checked. But what they found didn't add up. He said they had met at a bus stop. Just 5 minutes, he claimed. 5 minutes that were so ordinary, so unremarkable, that it barely seemed worth mentioning. He claimed he had given her 10 pounds and a cigarette. Just a brief exchange before she walked off into the night. And yet, something about his story didn't sit right. The detectives started with the basics, his phone records, his Oyster card. They checked the phone call logs, the bus records, and the CCTV footage. The timeline was off. If Moody had been at the bus stop when he said, his phone should have pinged in the same area, right? It didn't. It pinged in different locations. And the bus records? They didn't match either. The Oyster card data revealed something unexpected. It showed he had taken a bus from Deptford, where he met Maureen, to a much further location. A location that made no sense if he was telling the truth. He said they spoke for 5 minutes, but his story didn't fit the footage from the cameras. There he was, standing outside Richmond House, maneuvering a large trash bin, wearing surgical gloves. His movements weren't quick or innocent. He was careful, calculated. For a moment, the detectives paused as they reviewed the footage. There he was, alone in the basement of the building, his figure darting in and out of camera sight. The bin wasn't just being moved, it was being filled with something. Something Maureen wasn't around to see. What do you think happened inside that building after the cameras lost sight of them? Please share your thoughts. I am curious myself. The first red flag? The story didn't match the facts. The timeline, the locations, the details, everything was inconsistent. Mark's version of events fell apart with every piece of evidence. His lies were unraveling, one after the other. The detectives could feel it, too. They were getting closer. And yet, the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Why would he lie about something so simple? Why lie about the last moments they spent together? The mystery of what happened in that building, in those final moments, was still hidden. But the truth, like all truths, had a way of surfacing. And Moody, he was starting to crack under the pressure. As the investigation deepened, more red flags began to appear. Moody had a history, one that no one had seen coming. He wasn't just a quiet cleaner. He had worked in multiple buildings, had access to places where people didn't always watch. Was there more to his story? There had to be. But the truth, the real truth, wasn't just going to fall into the police's hands so easily. Detective Chief Inspector Kate Blackburn stood over the files, staring at the CCTV footage, the phone records, the Oyster card data, and the lies Mark Moody had told. There was something eerily calm about him, something cold. And the more they discovered, the more the weight of Maureen's disappearance began to settle. He had lied, but it wasn't just about one lie. It was the kind of lie that covered up a truth too dark to even imagine. And the truth, the detectives knew, was that Mark had not just killed Maureen. He had done something worse. They kept going. They kept asking more questions, searching for more evidence. They tracked his movements. They checked the bins he had moved, the places he had been. And every piece led to the same conclusion. But the most terrifying part? Maureen's body was gone. Erased. Destroyed. Richmond House is an unassuming block of flats in Deptford, southeast London. To the casual observer, it was just another nondescript building. But for Maureen and Mark, it was the final place she ever saw. The building had its share of rules. After hours, it was supposed to be locked down tight. Only residents, workers, and authorized personnel could get in after dark. But there were always cracks. There were always ways in. Moody knew exactly how to exploit those cracks. Around 10:30 p.m., Maureen and Moody arrived at the gate of Richmond House. The night was still, almost eerily so. There were no sounds of traffic, no bustling crowds, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The kind of night that felt too quiet. But as the gates opened to let a car through, Moody and Maureen slipped in behind it, unnoticed. They weren't supposed to be there. Not at that hour. Not in that building. And yet, there they were. Inside, the building seemed empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows in the sterile hallways. The smell of cleaning supplies and fresh paint lingered in the air, a reminder of Moody's daily work. It was his domain, a place where he could move freely and unnoticed, a place where he had access to things most people never saw. The security was minimal, only a few cameras in the hallways, the kind you'd expect in a rundown building. Nothing that would raise suspicion, nothing that would tell anyone the horror unfolding behind the scenes. As Maureen followed him inside, she had no idea that her life was about to end in the very building she thought was safe. She walked calmly, trusting him as they moved deeper into the corridors. What was it that drew her to him? Was it his familiar presence from their days at the Oval? Was she simply too trusting? We'll never know. At first, they appeared normal, just two people entering a building late at night, a man showing his colleague around. But as the minutes ticked by, something strange began to happen. Moody didn't seem to be in any hurry. He lingered, waiting, watching. His movements became deliberate, controlled. He was no longer just a cleaner. He was the predator. And then came the moment. At exactly 11:50 p.m., the footage caught him in the basement of Richmond House, near the cleaner's room. He was wearing gloves, large rubber gloves, and in his hands, he was maneuvering a massive communal trash bin, one that wasn't typically used at night. For a moment, he paused. His back turned to the camera, obscuring his actions. He moved the bin into a corner, out of sight. What was he hiding? For the next several minutes, he filled the bin with something or someone. But it wasn't just trash. It wasn't the usual piles of papers and food waste he had dealt with in the past. He was careful with his every move, making sure the bin was full. Then he left. Maureen was never seen again after 11:50 p.m. The trash bin was later removed, and no trace of her remained. Mark's timeline was unraveling, thread by thread. The truth was slipping through his fingers, but he wasn't ready to let go of his lies. So, he stuck to his version of the story. He insisted that Maureen had gone home after their brief meeting. But the police weren't buying it. They kept pressing him. They examined his behavior more closely, and that's when they found something that truly didn't add up. On December 6th, the day after Maureen's disappearance, CCTV footage showed Moody returning to the building. He wasn't there to work, not as a cleaner. No, he was there for something else. At 6:30 a.m., just hours after he claimed to have dropped Maureen off and gone home, Moody was seen once again in the basement of Richmond House, near the cleaner's room. He was alone. This time, he wasn't just moving trash. He was adding more waste to the bin. The same bin he had wheeled out of sight the night before. The same bin that would soon disappear, leaving only questions in its wake. The police began to piece together the terrifying truth. Mark hadn't just been lying about his timeline. He was actively covering up the crime. The investigators followed his movements with growing concern. They traced the bin's journey, the one that had left Richmond House and would eventually be taken away to an incineration plant. The bin, heavy with Maureen's remains, was collected on December 8th, just days after she had vanished. And that was it. The bin was gone. The waste, along with Maureen's body, was loaded into a truck, and the truck was sent to a processing plant in Essex. The scale of the search that followed was unprecedented. Hundreds of tons of rubbish were sifted through, day after day, by over 60 officers, determined to find something, anything, that could lead them to Maureen. It was one of the largest waste searches ever conducted in the UK. 2,750 tons of rubbish, 125 trucks, 20,000 hours of work, and still nothing. Nothing except for the sickening realization that Mark had left no trace of Maureen behind. He had erased her in the most brutal way possible. But what about his lies? What about his version of events? As the investigation continued, Moody's web of deceit grew more tangled. He had tried to explain away the inconsistencies with the CCTV footage and the phone records, but his lies were starting to fall apart. The truth was clear now. Mark wasn't just a man who had made a mistake. He was a man who had deliberately killed Maureen and tried to hide the evidence. He wasn't some helpless bystander who had happened to find himself caught up in a tragedy. He was the one who created the tragedy. As investigators pieced together the final moments of Maureen's life, they uncovered more details. The lies he had told, the manipulations, and the complete disregard for the woman who had once trusted him. All of it painted a picture of a cold, calculating murderer. Mark was no longer just a man with secrets. He was the man responsible for Maureen's death, and he was doing everything in his power to make sure no one would ever know the truth of what had really happened. Each officer worked tirelessly, searching through trash with the hope that just one piece of evidence would lead them to her. And each day, they grew more and more desperate. They knew what had happened to Maureen. They knew how Mark Moody had discarded her. But the one thing they could never understand was why. Why would he do this? And where was she now? But for Maureen's family, the hours, the days, and the weeks dragged on with little hope. Every time the phone rang, every time a door knocked, they prayed for good news. But each time, they were left with nothing but the unbearable weight of uncertainty. Maureen's mother, in particular, felt the weight of the search more than anyone. As the investigation continued, her heartache grew deeper. The pain of not knowing where her daughter was, or if she was even still alive, was a torment that no mother should ever have to endure. Through it all, Maureen's mother never stopped hoping. She never stopped believing that, somehow, her daughter would come home. But as the weeks turned into months, that hope was slowly chipped away by the harsh reality that Maureen was gone. And then came the moment that broke her completely. The police were finally able to confirm that Maureen's body was destroyed in the incinerator. No remains, no closure, just a mountain of waste and the agonizing knowledge that her daughter was lost forever. Maureen's mother, in an emotional statement, said it best. He is a coward, a cold-hearted murderer. It was the truth that no one wanted to admit. No one wanted to believe that Mark had done this. He had not only taken Maureen's life, but he had also robbed her family of the chance to say goodbye, to grieve properly, to even bury her in peace. The police didn't stop, though. Despite the heartbreaking lack of physical evidence, they pushed forward, determined to bring Maureen's killer to justice. Every officer involved in the search knew the stakes. This wasn't just a job, this was personal. They owed it to Maureen and her family to find the truth. The search stretched across months, and it became a haunting symbol of the lengths to which the police would go to ensure that no crime, no matter how heinous, went unpunished. The mountains of waste were moved from Deptford to Essex, a remote processing plant where the incinerator would forever destroy any trace of Maureen. The officers sifted through tons of garbage, literally digging for a needle in a haystack, hoping that somewhere in that mountain of refuse they might find something, anything, that could bring them closer to the truth. But no matter how hard they searched, they never found Maureen. She was gone, burned, reduced to nothing. And so, the search continued, not just for her body, but for justice. The Met Police knew they would never recover her remains, but they weren't about to let Mark slip away. They would bring him to trial. They would expose his lies, his deceit, and his cold-hearted crime. The pain of the family was immense, but they didn't give up. They couldn't. Maureen's mother, through every moment of devastation, kept fighting for her daughter. She wouldn't let her be forgotten. Even in the darkest hours, she knew that the truth was out there, and she refused to let it be buried with her daughter. The police search was an act of love, a tribute to Maureen from those who knew her, those who had never met her but knew her story, and those who would stop at nothing to ensure that justice was served. But as the search came to an end, the heartbreak wasn't over. For Maureen's family, the nightmare wasn't just about finding her body. It was about finding a sense of closure that would never come. Mark's arrest had been a long time coming. The police had worked tirelessly, piecing together his lies, his movements, and the undeniable evidence that proved one thing. He had killed Maureen. There was no doubt about it. The mystery of her disappearance had been unraveling, bit by bit. But it wasn't until the trial that the full extent of his crime would be exposed. The courtroom was quiet, the tension palpable. As the trial began, Mark sat in the defendant's chair, his expression unreadable, his hands folded neatly in front of him. No tears, no visible remorse, just silence. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. The kind that told everyone in that room that he had no intention of ever taking responsibility for what he had done. The prosecutor wasted no time. They started with the lies, the countless lies that Moody had told the police. His fabricated story about meeting Maureen at a bus stop for 5 minutes was shredded apart. Every single detail of his alibi crumbled under scrutiny. The CCTV footage, the Oyster card records, the phone evidence. It was all there. Proof that Moody had been lying from the very beginning. The prosecutor didn't need to say much more. The evidence spoke for itself. Moody's movements had been caught on camera. The waste bin, the gloves, the suspicious late-night actions at Richmond House. Everything pointed to him. And as the trial went on, it became clear that Mark was a man who would stop at nothing to cover up his crime. But what shocked everyone the most was his complete lack of remorse. In a case like this, where a young woman had been brutally murdered, most people would have shown at least some signs of regret. Not Moody. He sat there, cold and detached, as if nothing had happened. His silence was deafening. Finally, it was time for the judge to speak. And when he did, his words hit like a hammer. He looked directly at Mark Moody and said, "No one but you knows why you killed her." Those words resonated through the room. It was a powerful moment. The judge's statement was the cold, hard truth. No one would ever truly understand why Mark did what he did. The motives behind his crime remained locked inside his mind, hidden away in the dark recesses of his heart. As the judge delivered his verdict, the family of Maureen Gitau waited with bated breath. They had spent so long searching for answers, for some kind of closure, and now, finally, the man who had stolen their daughter from them would face the consequences. The trial wasn't just about finding out what happened to Maureen. It was about holding her killer accountable. And in that moment, justice was served. But even as the verdict was read and the courtroom erupted in murmurs, there was no joy, no celebration. Maureen was still gone. Her family was still grieving. The hole she left behind would never be filled. For Mark, the trial was just another chapter in his twisted tale. He had evaded responsibility for so long, but now, at least, he would be held to account. The sentence was harsh. Life imprisonment. A minimum of 20 years before he could even consider parole. But it didn't matter. No punishment would ever bring Maureen back. No prison sentence could undo the damage he had caused. The final words of the trial echoed in the air as the court adjourned. Maureen's family had finally received justice, but the pain would never go away. The search for her body, the endless days of uncertainty, and the cruel truth that she would never be laid to rest. These were the wounds that would never heal. And as Mark was led away in handcuffs, there was one final thought that haunted the courtroom. Why? Why did he do it? That question would remain unanswered forever. The trial had come to a close, but the horror of Maureen Gitau's death didn't end with a conviction. In many ways, it was just the beginning of another, darker chapter. A chapter that would haunt her family forever. Mark Moody had been sentenced to life in prison, but there was one final, devastating reality that they couldn't escape. Maureen's body had never been found. For Maureen's family, this was the greatest tragedy of all. They had suffered through the torment of not knowing where she was, of not knowing how or why she had been taken from them. But this was different. Without her remains, they could never bury her. They could never say goodbye in the way most families could. There would be no funeral, no place to visit, to mourn, to remember. The pain of it was unbearable. Every day, Maureen's mother woke up knowing that her daughter was gone, but her body, her final resting place, was an unsolvable riddle, hidden somewhere in the ashes of a massive incinerator. The thought that Maureen's life had ended, and her body destroyed, was more than any parent could bear. As time went on, the public reacted to the case with a mixture of horror and empathy. The tragic details were shared across news outlets, and people from all walks of life expressed their disbelief at the cruelty of Mark's actions. It wasn't just the murder that shocked the public, it was the way in which he had disposed of Maureen's body, as if she were nothing more than a piece of trash. A human life discarded in a waste bin, destroyed without a trace. On social media, people voiced their anger at the injustice of it all. There were calls for reform, for stronger punishments for crimes like this. Crimes that left victims with no voice, no way to speak from beyond the grave. And there were messages of support for Maureen's family, offering words of comfort, though no one could truly understand the depth of their loss. Behind closed doors, the police who had worked so tirelessly on the case couldn't escape their own feelings of regret. Detective Chief Inspector Kate Blackburn, who had led the investigation, spoke of her team's emotional toll. They had searched for months, poured over thousands of hours of footage, and sifted through tons of waste, all in the hope of bringing Maureen home. But despite their dedication, despite their best efforts, the one thing they could never give Maureen's family was the closure they desperately needed. The hardest part of this case, DCI Blackburn said in an interview, is knowing that we couldn't bring Maureen back. We failed to recover her body, and I'll never be able to stop regretting that. But we did everything we could. We never gave up. There was a heavy silence in the room when she spoke those words. For the officers involved, it was a reminder of the emotional burden they carried. They had brought the killer to justice, but the feeling of failure and not being able to return Maureen to her family was something they would never shake. And for Maureen's family, the lack of closure meant that the grief never fully went away. It was a wound that kept reopening. A family that had already been torn apart by loss now had to live with the uncertainty of not knowing where their loved one lay. In the months after the trial, Maureen's mother continued to speak out, not just for her daughter, but for all the victims of similar crimes. "We need to remember the people who are lost like this," she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. Maureen Gitau was only 24, a young woman with so much ahead of her, a life taken too soon. Her story, once full of promise, was nearly erased by a man who thought he could hide the truth with lies, and a trash bin that swallowed up the evidence. But despite all that, justice, though far from perfect, was served. Mark Moody was caught, convicted, and sentenced for his cold, calculated crime. But as we close this chapter, there's a question that lingers. Without a body, can closure ever truly come? Can Maureen's family, forever left with the emptiness of not knowing where she rests, ever find the peace they deserve? And what of the truth? Is it really complete? There are so many pieces still left scattered, unanswered questions, unspoken truths. Some believe Mark Moody wasn't acting alone, that someone else may have been involved. Do you think there's more to this story, something we don't know yet? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there someone else behind this crime? What do you think truly happened that night? And before you go, don't forget to share Maureen's story. Let her name live on, so she's never forgotten, and her truth, though incomplete, remains in the hearts and minds of those who care.